Okay, so Quinn, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the podcast.
Absolutely. I appreciate you having me on.
I mean, I've before this, I've given you such a grand introduction, but for people that may not be aware of you, can you just give us a brief overview of what it is you do at the moment?
Sure. I'm a physical therapist or a physiotherapist to anyone outside of the United States. I am in Southern California. I'm about an hour south of Los Angeles. I have a physical therapy office inside of a weightlifting gym, and that's the sport of weightlifting, the snatch and the clean and jerk. But we have different, various barbell athletes and team sport athletes and general public, but they all want to kind of do the same thing, which is throw some barbells around. So it's pretty cool. My office is big enough for my table and a couple other things, and then I open the door and I've got this weightlifting playground that we get to mess around with. So it's a definitely a dream environment, dream scenario. Most of my clientele are barbell sport athletes, and they come to see me if they have some bump in the road or something is derailing their training that they can't seem to manage. And I try to help guide them on the path and get them back into training the way that they want. So it's a fun gig. I enjoy it.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, working right there within a weightlifting gym because you're a weightlifter yourself as well. So
Yeah. So it's good. We can all kind of struggle together.
yeah, I mean, just thinking about things like the snatch and the clean and jerk, they're movements that require quite already a high level of movement ability. Do you find that that's kind of the number one thing you work with people that come into the gym?
Yeah, totally. I think the skill aspect is big. Yeah, I think to contrast with maybe traditional strength training or bodybuilding or even powerlifting, the skill of those training modalities and those movements isn't as high. Now, I would you can make an argument for powerlifting. There's a skill in being able to do a 1 rep max. Being able to balance that load and maintain certain technique, but you get into strongman, there's skill elements to that sport as well. And with the snatch, clean and jerk, the coordination aspect of things, the necessity to create high degrees of force, but also in the right direction, is definitely a challenging thing. And with the movements, people kind of equate their lack of ability to do so as with some type of restriction in range of motion, just almost like a structural thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that when you break it down, most people have adequate range to do the task. They just don't know how to coordinate their bodies. And that's a different quality.
Mm.
And I find that we spend a lot of our time learning how to coordinate their bodies and coordinate the pattern with appropriate doses of load. So if we get the right dose, that helps them learn the skill and and exercise some patience. And I find that people have some good success that way.
Yeah, I mean that instantly is a really interesting take that you were like a lot of people are like, oh, I don't have the mobility to get in this position, and you're actually, well, you have the range, you've just never done it before, and so it's a case of learning it properly.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about extremes just to anchor the conversation. Let's say somebody
Yeah.
has a fused ankle, a surgically fused ankle, or maybe even some type of birth abnormality where they have a joint that doesn't have an average amount of range of motion the way that you would see, just general population. Of course, those things may change the way that they get the task done, but even in those cases, let's say somebody has two fused ankles, it doesn't negate, it doesn't give them a red light. They can't, it's not that they can't perform the snatch and clean and jerk or a squat or a deadlift. It's just that it may look a little different, where their strategy to get the task done may be a little bit different than if those structural abnormalities weren't there. But on average, I find that people blame some type of structural or range of motion limitation that's not actually there. What they're mistaking for a structural abnormality is actually just their inability to coordinate the skill. And
Mm.
that's a completely different conversation. You'll get people who, let's say they can put a barbell over their head in the snatch grip and it's totally comfortable and the position looks fine. It looks sustainable and strong. And as soon as they go to overhead squat, the bar comes forward. And they'll say, well, my shoulders are just too, quote unquote, tight to do an overhead squat. Well, the logic breakdown is if your shoulders have the range of motion to hold the bar over your head in that grip, in the position that we want, then your shoulders have the range of motion, period.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the coordination of the overhead squat is a completely different animal. Can you maintain that position while you coordinate a full body movement? That's a different conversation. Then we could go with the lower body. People will, let's say they have an air squat that looks just fine, or a goblet squat, or a counterbalance squat that looks good, and you kind of tick the box off that they've got the hip and ankle range of motion to do a squat. But as soon as they try to front squat or overhead squat, their lower body positioning changes. And, you know, you get that perception of, oh, my hips don't go down here. Well, they actually just did. You know, I like to like take a video and just literally snapshot it in front of their face. You know, I could airbrush a barbell on top of you, and that would be a beautiful squat. So you possess the range of motion. What you don't possess is either the coordinative aspect of it and or the ability to hold those positions under load, which again are different qualities. So, you know, it's that whole training thing, and it's a process. But weightlifting is interesting because the loads, there's a sweet spot where if it's too heavy, you can't manage the positions, or you're not in control. But if it's too light, sometimes you don't have that feedback. So it actually does help even beginners to have a little bit of weight so that they can feel the positions a little bit better. Empty PVC pipe always, you know, it doesn't always help that. But no, it is on the daily basis. I think we're making the distinction between, do you have the requisite range of motion for the task? And do you have the coordinative quality for the task? You know, differentiating those things.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it was really funny what you said there about if they have the shoulder ability to get into that, you know, they have the range of motion to get into that overhead position with a wide grip. And then separately, they have the, you know, the hip and ankle range of motion to get into a good squat if they're in a goblet position or a counterbalance, you know, plate out squat, whatever. But then they just can't put those two together. Then it's like you have the prerequisite range of motion, but you're just missing the points together.
Yeah, totally. So it's like anything. I mean, think about literally any skill that you would need to string kind of multiple patterns into one. You know, barbell sports aside, throwing a baseball, shooting a basketball, kicking a ball, kicking a football. So it's like range of motion, unless you have some type of gross abnormality, you've got something there that we can work with. Now, I equate this, I always say training wheels. Training wheels has a negative connotation, but it kind of gets the point across, where if we establish that you have requisite range of motion, and even if you don't, what we're going to do is we're going to put constraints in place to set you up for success. And in the motor skill acquisition literature, they'll call this an affordance. So in weightlifting, very simply, first of all, weightlifting shoes, most of them have an elevated heel, which acts as a counterbalance. So even if people have Gumby ankles and they have all the range of motion in the ankles in the world, an elevated heel will still help them because it shifts their center of gravity up and forward so that they can counter that by sitting down, back, and upright without falling on their butt. Now they have muscles for that too, but elevating the heels, take the person who's got the shoulders, they've got the hips and ankles, but they need to put the two together. We'll give them a decent heel lift, even more than their weightlifting shoes, which basically takes the inability to coordinate the pattern out of the equation to some extent. It gives them a little bit of a buffer so that they can work on, say, just the overhead position. You know, their cue is from the belly button up, I shouldn't know whether you're squatting or standing. So, but if they have an extra heel lift, they can get into the squat a little bit more easily, and they can focus on the overhead component of the overhead squat.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, we start to whittle that extra heel lift away, and we start to add speed to that position in the form of, for example, snatch balance variations, where there's a little bit of a dip and pop, and you kind of punch the bar off your back into your overhead squat instead of just being slow. So we start to incorporate the velocity aspect of the lifts a little bit. So over time, you manipulate variation, range of motion, tempo, and load, obviously, and they learn the skill just like you would if you were learning how to pitch a baseball off a mound. Maybe you'd start a little closer than major league distance, and maybe you probably wouldn't try to wing 90-mile-an-hour fastballs when you're trying to work on accuracy in the beginning. But then over time, I think that's what people kind of forget is, there's a process to this thing. But it's fun. It's weightlifting is predictable and it's objective, unlike, let's say, a team sport where the weight room is there to develop skills, but then you've got the sport itself. There's a whole lot more going on. But with barbell sports, you can really track progress easily, and it's you don't have somebody who's going to take your legs out when you're lifting the bar. So practice, we can track things pretty accurately.
Yeah, well, hopefully you don't have someone trying to take you out while you're
maybe
trying to lift the bar, but they might bring
sport.
that in. Yeah, full contact CrossFit or whatever it would be, but I think there's I think there's enough crazy ideas out there. I think it was great how you broke that down, though. I think that's what people miss, is that this idea, as you said, it's like these complex weightlifting movements and even other barbell movements like squats and bench press and deadlifts, which are typically more simple but still have a lot of movement parts to them. If you break these down into basic movement patterns, I guess, and into constituent parts and work on them first and then bring them together, then add load, then add speed, you're following that natural progression rather than just like, hey, I'm just going to try and throw 60 kilos over my head, but let's see what happens.
Well, and I think you kill two birds with one stone, because the rebuttal is always, well, what if somebody does have that range of motion restriction? They truly do, but the answer would be the same. You would still find a variation. So sometimes it can't be the bar at the beginning. Sometimes I'm just getting somebody in to be able to put their arm over the head for the first time doing a landmine press, and that's their snatch.
Yeah.
For the time being, but you take that top-down approach and you figure out the entry point is the term that I like to use. What is this person's entry point to getting in and starting to train the skill of whatever particular movement that is? And you have so many training variables at your disposal: range of motion, tempo, load, variation, position. You can alter your biomechanics, to experiment with different leverages and load distributions, and your range of motion, to whatever potential that it has to improve, will improve over the course of that process, just like your skill of the coordinative aspect of it will improve. So it's not a separate prescription to increase range of motion. It's the same thing. Your cells respond to load. It's just that if somebody does have more of a gross range of motion restriction, the starting point may be a little different, and the length of the process may be a little bit different. And I always say it like this, especially with like the ankles. If somebody's maybe not ever had an ankle injury, they don't have fused ankles, they just happen to be one of those people who doesn't have a whole lot of ankle dorsiflexion, they might not ever actually get that much more. Let's say it's like a 30-year-old. You're probably maxing your potential to actually create more structural change in the bones and the connective tissues, maybe not all that great, but at minimum, you can at least get more control in the range of motion that you have. And most people don't even have that. So, low hanging fruit, let's control what you got. And anything that is beyond that over time, that's just kind of icing on the cake.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that idea of, as you said, it's a case of, well, if you have got these restrictions, well then let's just work with what they are. And it's a case of knowing where you're at and saying, look, I know that you want to get to this position where you want to do these barbell movements, but right now for you, you need to add load in, as you said, like this incline push, half kneeling position, get you moving well. Let's add load over time. We're going to be able to progress you. But you're using dynamic movements and loading to teach people the skills and get people moving in the right positions, as opposed to static stretching, I guess.
As opposed to static stretching, or and also as opposed to just a bunch of verbal cueing vomit,
Mm,
where it's like, and we've all been there, where you're just kind of beating your head against the wall trying to get this person to do what you want them to do from a movement perspective, and it can be frustrating on both ends. And if you think about movement in regards to components, and you think about those variables that I listed as constraints that you can manipulate to set the person up for success,
mm.
well, now you can let the movement teach the positions. So this the snatch balance, I went back to that. If people don't know what that is, they can just YouTube snatch balance, but you can
Yeah,
watch
most,
that.
yeah.
You can watch that exercise and say, well, the exercise, to even do the movement, it teaches you how to get into the bottom of the overhead squat with speed. To
Hmm.
even just get the task done, you have to have the quality, or you have to try. A landmine press, if somebody has trouble getting their shoulder over their head, I could yell at them to reach and to lock their shoulder out. But if they just don't have that quality, the landmine press is a nice intermediate. At least they feel what it's like to put that barbell at some angle that's heading in that direction. And then we cut that barbell in half, and maybe it's a dumbbell overhead press. That's our entry point. But it's done with intent. It's not just like throwaway volume, like accessory volume, where you're just blasting through a bunch of reps. We're talking
Hmm.
about skill acquisition. It has to be deliberate practice. And I find what we've just talked about, I lay it out for people just like that. I mean, I don't feel like what we talked about is very high level doctor speak. We said we're
No.
going to lighten the load, we're going to slow things down, reduce the range of motion. Like, people get that as long as you spell it out for them and say, this is where we are and this is where we plan to go.
Hmm.
Here's how we get there, and you just have to be patient with the process. I find that people appreciate it, and at least they have some answers.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can break it down then into those parts of, this is why we're doing this movement. And then after that, it's going to be about going to here and then here. And it's mapping them out a journey of progression that they can then be bought into. Because otherwise they're like, well, why am I doing this? I'd rather go and do that. Like, or yeah, they want like a faster
Totally.
way to it if they don't understand that process to it.
And I think when we talk about it, people wonder, well, so when do people actually get to lift? Well,
Mm,
they're lifting normal in the movements that they have. So let's say somebody wants to do like a powerlifting or strength training or a weightlifting, they want to try that stuff. The overhead squat or the snatch is just not quite there from either a range of motion or a coordinative aspect, or just both. And we're working on it, but we're working on it in a very methodical way, the way that we've discussed. Well, that doesn't mean that they're not training other movements relatively normally, and we're progressively overloading the way that we normally would. So,
mm,
things like deadlifting and back squatting and maybe strict barbell pressing or whatever it is, if those things are on the table, as far as they've got the range of motion, they're comfortable, we're training those like we normally would. So
mm,
it's concurrent training. We're getting strong, we're working on the skills that need to be brought up, but it's not just that. And we may have days as well where we're working lighter loads and maybe more range of motion on a particular pattern, but then another day where we're reducing the range of motion, but we're pushing the load on the same pattern. So you get kind of like a different focus. Let's say
mm,
with a front squat, for example, they're just kind of getting used to the front rack and being upright like that. Maybe they came from a kind of a butt hips back background where they're really squat morning everything, and makes a front squat pretty tough when you do that. So they're just getting used to that. So we may have one day where we're doing light, full range of motion tempo front squats where they've got a lot of time in that set to get used to the positioning and to really hone in on the posture, quote unquote, or the position that's required to support the bar. But then we've got another day, maybe later on in the week, where we do pin front squats. So we constrain or we reduce the range of motion, but we can load it heavier.
Mm-hmm.
So they're still controlling position on both days, but reducing the range of motion maybe to part of the range where they've got really good control. We can overload that to try to get some heavy weight within that pattern. And then we look for those two days or those two ideas to converge over time into just, you can load front squats, normal tempo, normal range of motion with progressive overload.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so that's great. As you said, it's getting them still to do what they can do and breaking that down into parts, allowing them to load up those separate parts differently. I think it's just great to map people out a plan. I mean, I think what would be really good to clarify for a lot of the listeners, because we've basically gone straight in and been like, right, let's talk about range of motion, let's talk about movements, because a lot of the time I think there's still a big hype over this whole flexibility versus mobility, banded stretches, foam rollers, that kind of thing. Do these things have a place in this world, or do you think that there are a time and a place for both, or is it a case of maybe they're flogging the wrong horse or a dead horse, for want of a better word?
Yeah. It kind of depends on how nihilistic I want to be about this topic, like how much coffee I've had, what time of the day. But, we'll back up. It's like before all that stuff existed, people trained. So let's just not forget that, like we've survived this long without those things. But I'll say this. So I'm going to bucket most of the things that you mentioned into the same category. So foam rolling passively, you're just laying on, rolling around on it, having it smash your flesh, or taking a heavy foam roller or a piece of metal and just inverting the order and rolling that on you or the barbell, rolling it on your thigh. The banded stretches, passive stretching really of any kind, all the balls and the guns now that they have, like all that stuff, it all goes into the same bucket. The reason it all goes in the same bucket is because there's no evidence up to this point that the mechanisms at which they work are any different. They are just different means of the same end. And that end is not to say that there's no effect. There is an effect. I fully concede that you feel a certain way, you do those things, and you feel a different way many times, not for everybody. But that is the effect is just that. It's a feeling, it's sensory based. It's short term. So let's think of examples that don't use those things, but that are similar. Have you ever jammed your finger and shook it in the air just kind of instinctively? You're like, shit, or you bang your knee against a table and you just kind of instinctively rub it. So those are what you're doing is you have a strong sensory stimulus. It's an abrupt one. You try to override it with another abrupt sensory stimulus, rubbing the area, shaking your finger in the air. Well, these tools work by similar pathways in that they provide a sensory input. And that's about as far as we know about it. I'd love to get fancy. I could say it's a neurophysiological input, and that wouldn't be a lie, but there are myriad of pathways at which that could work, and we're not there to be able to differentiate or explain those. So those things provide sensory input, and there is an effect. There's an effect of decreased pain perception, soreness in a lot of people. There is increased range of motion. Static stretching increases range of motion. There's no doubt about that. The effects are typically short term, as in that whatever you felt change goes away, and it doesn't take that long for it to go away. I don't mind people doing it. My problem, though, is when they choose those modalities over the things that we've already discussed, which is deliberate practice with skill, or if it's an injury scenario, they're relying on those things to quote unquote fix them, as opposed to behavior change, which is essentially training differently, making better decisions with your training or with your life or other lifestyle factors that are affecting your injuries. So that's where we have a problem, is when those things take precedent over things that will have more of a physiological or a long-term effect. My other argument for those, against those things, or against using them to any extreme degree, I guess, is that they're not, those effects that they provide are not effects that are individual or specific to them. You can have that sensory or that short-term change just by warming up. I mean, raise your hand if you've ever gone to the gym feeling like not so great, and then you just got really warm. Maybe you jumped on the bike, or maybe you just grabbed the bar and did a ton of empty bar work, and you just really, really did a thorough warm up, more so than you typically would. And it felt better. You just felt better. That's the same thing, but now you just use movement to do it, and you got practice with the skill of the movement, and you got to the same end. So the passive stuff, to me, as far as I can tell, is not providing anything novel or special that you couldn't get from just doing movements. That's the short and long answer, I suppose, of where I stand on that stuff. And people generally know, because I've been talking. There's not a lot of things that I have held pretty steady on. Like my mind, I've evolved on a lot of topics over the past several years, as you know, we should, as we learn more and we figure out what we were wrong about. But this is a topic that I haven't really changed much on, because the evidence hasn't really changed much.
Yeah.
That, you know, and it's been, people know when they're coming in, but they'll still kind of ask me, so can I still do this stuff? And I say, yes, you absolutely can, if you like it. Some people don't. You know, some people are like, thank God, because I can't stand rolling on that thing.
Yeah.
But I say, yes, you can absolutely still do it. If it's going to be part of your pre-training routine, what I would recommend is that you put it as close to, or in between, as close to the goal, the movements that you're going to actually be training, or even in between the warm-up sets, mostly to save time, but two, to take advantage. If you're going to get some type of short-term sensory change, you might as well like go right into a movement, as opposed to doing it 30 minutes beforehand, and then you just kind of start losing those short-term effects before you even get into the stuff.
Yeah.
And to finish training, I think some people, it's good to have a pre-training or a post-training routine. Post-training routine where you start to wind down, and you let your body kind of come down from the training. And some people like to just do like a nice easy foam rolling session or a nice stretching session after. And I don't think the effects of that have anything to do with the local effects of the roller or the stretching, but I think it's the ritual of kind of like calming down, starting to shift out of that, you know, sympathetic training mode, and starting the recovery cascade, for whatever that means. I think that's probably a big benefit of massage as well, for people who enjoy massages, is that it's therapeutic in the sense of it's you time. You know, it's an hour of you just relaxing, being comfortable, hopefully being off your phone, you know, and it's just something that you can you can quiet your mind a little bit for that period of time. And I think that's therapeutic for sure. I don't think you would need those things in particular to have that type of environment, but you know, there can be an argument for it.
Yeah. No, I think it was a great summary, as you said, to lump them all into one bucket and say, look, you're basically warming up the joints or the tissues that you're rolling or stretching or banding in that moment. And it would be the same as it's a short physiological improvement. You're not improving your long-term range of motion. It's like that guy that comes in, he's like, I've got tight ankles, I need to throw this band around my ankle before I do any squat sessions. And it's like, well, you're doing that every time you come in and squat. So it's not it's not exactly like you're making any long-term change, are you?
Clearly not working. And I would argue that, like, I gave the front squat pin, the pin front squat example as a way to like teach the position. When
Hmm.
we talk about like what's actually going to change tissue, and it's hard, especially the ankles, to truly alter the structural mechanics, like give you more range of motion from a structural standpoint.
Hmm.
But I don't think people even have access to their end range. Like the end range that you have, you probably don't even get to that very well.
Hmm.
And when we talk about what is going to change tissue, it's load. The mechanotransduction is what alters cells. It's mechanical tension and mechanical load is what's going to make a change. And the passive modalities just don't provide that much mechanical load.
Hmm.
If, let's say, you did a pin squat, you put a barbell on your back and you put pins in the rack, or you go to a box, you squat to a box, and you reduce the range of motion by half. So you're only going about halfway down, but your only focus is as you descend into the squat, you're going to drive your knees forward. Your feet are still flat, but if you're working on ankles, as you descend into the squat, you're going to drive your knees forward and keep your hips underneath you, and you're going to actually use your ankles. And when you hit the pins, in order to stand up, you're going to get your hips underneath you, and you're going to drive your knees forward using dorsiflexing your ankles, and you stand
Hmm.
up from that point. To me, and maybe I'm a bro, but to me, that is quote unquote mobility work. There is nothing that's going to put more load or create more of a cascade or signal for change than that type of stressor.
Hmm.
And you're incorporating it into the pattern. So you're kind of getting both of those things. If I think stretching and mobilization will give you a short-term change, but your body doesn't mean that you're going to access that change when you go in to do the actual pattern itself.
Hmm.
And I find that a lot of times people don't. I mean, I have lifters that it can do the splits 3 different ways, but when they overhead squat, they look like a baby giraffe. So flexibility and range of motion doesn't always transfer.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's a great point as well because you get a lot of barbell athletes who want to focus on just going to yoga, um, or doing. We won't like throw any sort of companies under a bus, but doing sort of like app-based stretching for like an hour in a night time to improve their kind of like barbell sport. But it's a kind of they, is it really doing anything for them?
Well, so again, if the narrative, it's really about the narrative. Like if they say I do that routine at night because it helps me wind down. I turn my
Hmm.
phone off and I
Hmm.
do my routine, and it's my signal for bed. Like it helps my body signal sleep time. I'm 100% cool with that.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, it's what you said. No, I do that so I can get better at the snatch, clean, and jerk, or whatever like active movement I'm going to do 12 hours later. It doesn't work like that.
Hmm.
And things like yoga are interesting. Like I like yoga for other people. I suck. Like it's not just not comfortable for me. I don't enjoy doing it, but
It's so
I think
hard.
it's good. Like it's so hard. It gets people moving. Like I got no problem with that. But Pilates, I mean, really, it's movement's movement. I mean,
Yeah.
you can put a stigma on these things, but like at the end of the day, what are we actually talking about here? But things like yoga, I find that people who are good at it are just they were not good at it because yoga made them good at it necessarily. They were always the bendies
Hmm.
and the people that enjoyed it because they could just relax into those positions.
Hmm.
And the people that probably could benefit from yoga don't ever do it because it's so uncomfortable. It's like this selection bias. So I mean, you could probably say that for a lot of sports. The attributes of the activity kind of pick the people, and then
Yeah.
weed out over time. But
Hmm.
those, even I would say things like Pilates and yoga that have an active component, I think would probably give you more bang for the buck because you've got to be able to control your body.
Hmm.
People will say, well, what about gymnasts? They have crazy range of motion. Yes, but gymnasts can control every millimeter of that range of motion. They
Hmm.
can do the splits on the floor, but they can also do that same exact position in the air, holding those positions. And they have adapted and hone in those skills over the course of years.
Mm.
So it's this process of training that I think is lost on people sometimes. But long story short, you can keep your foam roller if you like it. Just don't rely on that to be the thing
Yeah.
that gets you where you want to go.
I think that's the important point, as you said. If you're spending 30 minutes at the start of your session, like foam rolling on a lacrosse ball, using a Theragun, um, using banded stretches, and then trying to go straight into your workout. Whereas actually, you could have spent 30 minutes doing the kind of exercises that you and I talked about at the beginning of this episode. Then you've kind of put the cart before the horse.
Yeah. Well, and I get it too. You go into the gym, and it very rarely do you just feel great like that first squat.
Mm.
It usually doesn't feel that great.
No.
You're like, oh Lord, and like every joint pops, and you feel like 30 years of your life in that one squat. And then but that tricks you, it makes you think that you have to now warm up for your warm up,
Mm.
but you don't. You could keep squatting, just your body weight. You could just keep doing that. Like the first
Mm-hmm.
few are going to suck. So what? Keep going.
Mm-hmm.
I promise you, you hit that inflection point that, oh, I'm warm now. Like, that feeling where all of a sudden your body just kind of shifts
Mm-hmm.
and things start feeling a little bit smoother. And like, you wake up a little bit and you're like, all right, I'm ready to throw some weight on there. I think I got the juices flowing. You can get that by doing more of the movement. You don't have to go and do something non-specific to get that, to then have to come back to that very same movement and warm it up anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like you would go and stretch and foam roll and then come back and now you can just load the barbell up to your top sets. No, you would have to still like take the empty bar and move it around and like do your warm-up set. So you're not taking anything away. You're just adding on unnecessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if anything, if you are short on time for training, it's a case of just do more lifting. You'll get more out of it.
Yes.
Rather than spending the 20 to 30 minutes on that piece of kit. I think it was a good point, as you said, around the stretching at night or getting a massage, and that if that helps people turn off, get some extra mindfulness, help them wind down and then improve their sleep. It's like, well, those are the lifestyle factors that are improving your recovery and your soreness, as opposed to the modalities themselves.
For
I thought
sure.
it was quite interesting. So, I mean, let's talk about when things do go wrong. Let's talk about a bit about pain and injuries, because I guess for someone who's a physical therapist or a physiotherapist, whichever term we want to use, it can be quite tough to, you don't have an MRI machine there with you, right? So assessing individuals, it's a case of tell me where it hurts with what movements, and then you're basically assessing, is it actual tissue damage, or are they just feeling that pain in that movement? How do you go about, I guess, finding the difference?
Well, sometimes it doesn't matter. So, I
Right.
mean, the history will tell you a lot. If it's the person says, yeah, yesterday I was playing basketball and I came down on someone's foot and I sprained my ankle, I heard 3 pops, and then I look at their ankle and it's the size of a grapefruit, we can say that you've got some tissue damage there.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's somebody who says, yeah, I just kind of get this dull ache in my lower back, how long has that been going on? Oh, 10 years. It's like, okay, well, and for those people, thank goodness I don't have an MRI machine, because 50% of the asymptomatic population have abnormalities on their MRI, whether they're ever going to feel back pain or not. So that person
Yes.
probably
Yeah.
does have something. Whether or not it's going to be an actual contributor is a different conversation. So
Mm.
and I'm gonna try to spin this as if so I don't sound like a broken record, but at the end of the session, ultimately, it is the same.
Right.
I'm going to get back to the whole like pain thing, because pain is just so complex. But we identify, the way that I practice is I identify the movements that you are no longer able to do or manage, and that's why you're coming to see me.
Mm-hmm.
People don't necessarily come to see me because they're in pain. They come to see me because they can no longer do the things that they want to do the way that they want to do them. or
Right.
they feel like they can't manage the situation themselves. Pain just happens to be a commonality in that scenario a lot of times. It's not always, but a lot of times it is. So first and foremost, we establish what their goals are. And I'm going to say functional goals. Function just means what do they want to get back to?
Hmm.
What are those triggers? And what variation or what version of that activity can we find an entry point towards to get back into going back towards it? So whether it's weightlifting, we've been just talking about barbell sports, but it's anything. It's running, it's gardening, anything physical. We can figure out what exactly is required from a physical standpoint, and then figure out how we can develop those qualities or increase their tolerance to those positions
Hmm.
while using all the same variables that we talked about before.
Right.
Tempo, range of motion, dosage, sometimes it's just a volume or intensity thing,
Hmm.
regardless of what activity it is. Sometimes we just have to go a little bit easier or a little bit less,
Hmm.
and we don't have to do anything extra. And I feel bad for you even coming in to my office for me to tell you, just go a little bit lighter for,
Yeah.
like 3 or 4 weeks. But, pain, so the big, for the last several years, pain science is a thing. The science of pain, as I like to describe it, that pain it's not an actual science per se, because pain is just a construct that comes out of sciences:
Hmm.
physiology, biology, psychology, sociology. Those are the sciences. Pain is a construct of experience that experience that we've named, that we've termed pain. And the biopsychosocial model of pain, which was kind of crafted in the 70s as a way to explain the pain experience beyond that of, oh, you're like a hinge on a rusty door. You got a knee that's very mechanical. It just needs to be oiled up. So that whole biomedical kind of mechanical approach to pain was just a very limited view on the pain experience, because it's very much an experience. It's a subjective experience. So you can't separate the physical aspect from the psychological aspect, and you can't separate those two aspects from the ecological aspect or the environmental aspect, because we are constantly interacting with both ourselves, mind and body, and the environment. So these spheres cannot be separated. And so
Hmm.
that's the biopsychosocial model in a nutshell, is we're trying to understand that dynamic interplay. We still don't really understand it. We just understand that it's more complex than just saying your tissues are broken, so the pain that you experience is 100% correlated to the damage that's done in your tissues, because that's just there's too much data in every part of the body to show that that's not correct. You
Hmm.
can experience distress or pain with completely clear imaging, and you can have completely abnormal imaging and not experience pain. So there are extremes to both ends.
Yeah.
Um, so that right there just tells you it's more than just structure.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean that structure doesn't matter. It just means that there's more there, and it makes it more complicated and less linear. So with all that said, I don't sit people down and give them an hour pain science education talk, because that's actually been shown not to work. People
Yeah.
don't,
Yeah.
I would zone out. And so, but what we do is we set realistic expectations right off the jump. And that's, I think, one of the most important parts, is that example that I gave the person with 10 years of back pain.
Hmm.
If I, as a clinician, were to say, all right, I got a good feeling about you. I think in 3 months, you'll probably be pain free. Setting up false expectations like that, or them correlating all their goals to pain, writing their goals down: 2 months, be pain free, or 3 months, be pain free. You've really got to set expectations right away that managing the pain experience is probably a better way to frame things than be pain free or don't be pain free. It's like this, where do we cross that line? Oh, once I'll get over this thing, I can't wait for that day. But that's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily how this works. And anybody with an injury, especially those with chronic injuries, can tell you it's up and down. It's nonlinear. Uh, it's multiple factors at play. I get less sleep. I feel more pain. These types of things. So what we do is we say we're going to manage your pain experience while we progress you towards getting back to the things that you want to do
Mm-hmm.
in a way that you're not able to do them now.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that goes over a lot better when we base goals off of objective um, function and capacity rather than goals on pain specifically.
Mm-hmm.
But rather, pain is just the thing that we have to navigate through the process.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I find that so interesting, that what you said about how people could have pain but nothing wrong tissue wise, imaging wise, and then vice versa. Like there's that fact, isn't there, that probably quite a lot of people will have issues with their back but no pain from it. And um, I think then, as you said, managing pain becomes the main part of the problem. So it's, how would you break that down for people? As you said, would just be finding ways for them to do the movements that doesn't elicit that pain response, and then working them in it, and then trying to progress them?
Yeah, it kind of depends because a lot of times for the person who has been experiencing pain for 10 years and they say that they experience it when they bend down and tie their shoes, but yet they want to get back to all these physical things. If I were to say, well, all of our exercises have to be pain free, well, that would be damn near impossible. So
Right.
a lot of these cases, it's not about being pain free per se, but it's about being okay with the degree that you're feeling. So
Right.
graded exposure is a concept that started in psychology, with kind of fear-based learning, where if you have an exaggerated fear of, let's say, the dark,
Mm.
you don't just lock somebody in a dark room and hope that, maybe that'll work, but that's exposure therapy. That's not graded. It's just straight
Yeah.
up exposure therapy. But if you wanted to grade the exposure, you would use like a dimmer. You'd have them sit in a room, it's super bright, and then you dim it a little bit and let them, they freak out a little bit, but not a lot. And they chill out. When they chill out, you dim it a little bit more. But that's where I think exercise comes in with a lot of things in rehab. It's providing some type of physiological effect, but it's also a form of graded exposure for the person,
Mm-hmm.
for their tissues and nervous system, and that whole interplay that you can't separate. But for the person with low back pain, we're probably you're gonna feel your symptoms through this process, and I give them,
Mm-hmm.
that's somewhat going to be somewhat necessary because they expect to feel pain and they have conditioned it to be a negative experience. Well, now, you know
Mm-hmm.
what? We're going to condition it to be somewhat of a positive experience because you're going to feel your symptoms, but then you're going to be able to do more and you're going to realize that they don't have this hold on you that they used to. And sometimes that can have an effect on the symptoms themselves. Sometimes it doesn't. They feel the same, but they're not as worried about it.
Mm-hmm.
And they're able to just do more and be a human again. So there's a fine line. It's not ignoring pain, though. If obviously if your foot or you get somebody feels like, or it feels like somebody shot you in the back,
Mm.
or back off a little bit.
Yeah.
But the way that I usually describe it, I say, if it's a chronic situation, I've deemed it appropriate that feeling a little bit of their familiar symptoms is okay
Yeah.
within this process. I usually give them some simple guidelines and I'll say, you're allowed to feel your thing. And I say it just like that. You're from, whatever it is, as long as it wouldn't change the way that you move because of it. So let's say it's a deadlift and we're dealing with back pain.
Mm-hmm.
You bend over, you pick up the bar, you start moving some weight, and you notice like, oh, there's my spot. Oh, I feel it. It's there. This is kind of a normal day.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like it's gone. But I'm moving the way that I would move even if it wasn't there. Then we're in the clear.
Mm-hmm.
But if you start feeling yourself shielding stress from that area or moving differently to avoid provoking that area, or just moving differently in fear or apprehension of provoking that area, then something needs to change,
Hmm.
because we're not grading exposure at that point. We're trying to avoid exposure.
Hmm.
So we're not getting anything out of that. And so if we're able to move as we normally would, that's kind of like we tick that box off. That's good. And then we monitor what happens after the training session that evening, 24 to 48 hours later. What's the response? And it's very common for the body to respond to the stress, especially with tendinopathy type things, with tendon pain. You have to load the tendon. They thrive on high load, but at the same time, load is also what pissed it off in the first place. And so it's this paradox. But you may get a response from our loading protocol.
Hmm.
But here's the timeline that we are okay with. We do the exercises. You have a little bit of a flare up, and within a kind of 24-hour window, that's your body's just response to the stress. But
Hmm.
then by the time we're ready to hit, a day 2 of our loading program, you're kind of back to the baseline that you were before day 1.
Hmm.
And we're okay.
Yeah.
If you feel like things are accumulating on you, though, like by the end of the week, day 1, day 2, day 3, all just kind of like avalanched on you, and by the end of the week, training quality is terrible, that's a problem. We need to
Yeah.
adjust the dosage from the prior day. So
Hmm.
I'm constantly monitoring those responses and, proceeding with caution, making note. Oh, I had a little flare up today. Okay, doesn't mean we have to change anything necessarily, but let's see if that's a pattern, or let's
Hmm.
see if it dies back down to baseline, that type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Uh,
go ahead.
No, no, no. I was going to say that's a great point. As you said, you're going to expect a bit of a flare up after you've worked that tissue, because that's just the body's response. But it's whether that then gets worse and worse, or it comes back down, and you're like, cool, we can go again.
I mean, there's always the question of like when is it okay to push? And I don't ever have a good answer to that unless I had the person in front of me, and it's not just my decision. We talk about these things like with the example of somebody with an ankle that blew up like a grapefruit because they sprained
Mhm.
it yesterday. Yeah, we don't need to grade exposure right now. Let's just let it
Yeah.
chill out a little bit. We can still move it. So, being open chain, just kind of range of motion of the ankle, maybe even some TheraBand resistance. I mean, that's where that stuff is warranted.
Hmm.
But let Mother Nature do her thing. That actual inflammatory cascade, like that needs to be there. That's what's driving the healing process. So let's let that happen.
Hmm.
It's when we get in, but that's not usually when people come to see me. People come to
No.
see me typically when things have been going on for a while,
Yeah.
which is much more complex and much less linear. With the ankle sprain, you can pretty much predict, especially if it's their first one. In 2 weeks, swelling is going to be markedly decreased. It's probably still going to look not the way that you want it to. In a month, swelling is going to be pretty well back to normal, but you probably kind of still be apprehensive. 6, 8 weeks, 12 weeks from now, you're probably pretty much back, but there's a more predictable pattern. We can never predict anything. There's always bumps in the road. But when it comes to that example of 10 years of back pain, there is no prediction whatsoever. It's a coin flip on any given day.
Hmm.
And that's why it's so important to give the person self-efficacy and tools to be able to manage. You educate them on how they can modify the movement
Hmm.
if it's a bad day. And that way, if they go to the gym and it's they're feeling kind of crummy, it's not, oh well, here we go again, and they just leave and it's the woe is me thing. No,
Hmm.
they know that if it's a bad day, they go a little lighter, or they do rack pulls instead of full, from the floor, or they slow the tempo down, or they decrease the volume, or they've got all these options now
Hmm.
because you educate them on that stuff. And now they always get a day, and you can say, this happens to me. People who aren't injured just have bad days, and we do the same thing. It just happens to be that pain keeps our ceiling down a little bit,
Hmm.
but it's still training, and then you give them opportunities for success too. If they're having a good day and they feel better than they expected or better than normal, we give them an opportunity to push it a little bit because they haven't been able to do that for a while. So So if we set expectations right up front, that pain is not this linear kind of black and white dichotomous thing where there's going to be this magic day where they're just out of it and it doesn't come back. That's not the
Mm.
reality of the situation. So once we have that conversation, which needs to be had at multiple time points, because they always understand on day one, and then they have a flare up and they forget everything, and then you have to tell them the exact same thing again.
Yeah.
Which is totally fine. I get it. The 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 training process is also, if you can give them the tools to manage things on the fly so that they don't constantly feel like they need you. Like, I'm still there guiding the ship, but I love it when my athletes, I'm reading kind of their notes on the day and they're like, yeah, I wasn't feeling it today, so I just did pin squats instead, or just did their thing instead. Like, they're learning.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't freak out about it. They didn't just leave. They just modified and they moved on. Like, that doesn't mean you have to be happy about it, but that right there, those things add up.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, training is a game of attrition. And it's the people who can keep the needle moving forward are the ones who succeed,
Mm-hmm.
rather than the people who are kind of in that all or nothing mentality where if they can't train exactly the way that they want to train, they just don't train.
Yeah.
And they have this, these gaps. The last 5 years, you have this 6-month gap during this year, and then you didn't train for 10 months during that year, and you took 3 months off during that year, and it's like, that's so much time where you're basically backsliding, becoming deconditioned, and then
Mm-hmm.
anytime that you hit the gym after that, it's just you trying to climb out of that hole
Mm-hmm.
until the next time that you slide back out of it. There's never progress. And so the coach and clinician are in such an important position in that they can teach the athlete to get out of that type of spin,
Mm.
if that makes
But
any sense.
oh yeah, no, it was perfect. No, it was really good. I think that gives a lot of people a lot of food for thought, especially as you said about it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And if you give people that ability to, hey, if you have a good day, you can push it a little bit more, be aware that it might have a flare up the day after. But if you're having a bad day, because as you said, things like sleep, and work stress and commuting and poor nutrition and all these other lifestyle factors are going to play into that person's pain as well. So
Totally.
like if you go in and you're having a really shitty day, then we've got other ways for you to do these movements that are going to allow you to still train. You don't have to do yourself over or just go home and do nothing. So I think that was great. Quinn, you've been fantastic. I think you've given the listeners a lot of value. Where can they go to find out more from you and more things that you've done?
Well, again, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed the conversation. I can be found on most social media. So you just type in my name. I have it. I don't know any other Quinn Henochs. So my Instagram is quinn.henoch.dpt, I believe. And you can type my name into Facebook. I've got a personal and a coaching page, but they're both the same.
Mm-hmm.
Social media is just what we do to put content out. And then all the clinical athlete social medias as well. So
Mm-hmm.
clinical athlete on Instagram, clinical athlete on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. I think those are the best places to find us. And you can always email us, info@clinicalathlete.com, if you have questions about this stuff. We've got a lot of content and courses and podcasts. I mean, like this, it's free content, man. I mean, I love having a podcast because people can ask me questions and I'll be like, just go listen to episode 22,
Yeah.
and it's free. And this is the type of thing that really, really helps spread the word to people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's great stuff.
Yeah, cool. I'll link all those up in the show notes as well, so people have those links of where to go. So yeah, thank you again for coming on.
Absolutely. I really appreciate it. This was fun.